Roxanna Valdez. Where is the threshold that, once crossed, marks the point of no return? How does an ordinary woman go from being a devoted wife and cherished mother to becoming a ruthless killer, ultimately polarizing an entire nation? And how does her name become a fixture in local conversations and dominate newspaper headlines for years to come? Roxanna Valdez might hold the answer. Killers don't wear signs. They don't stand out at dinner. Sometimes, they share our homes, indistinguishable from those who never cross that line. They look like everyone else, until they don't. That's why no one could have predicted what Roxanna would do on that spring evening of April 5, 2014. And once the truth came to light, the disbelief was overwhelming. But to understand the story, we must go back to where it all began. Roxanna's past remains mostly a mystery. Despite the determined efforts of numerous Chilean journalists eager to uncover her story, almost nothing surfaced about Roxanna Valdez. Her criminal record offered only the barest trace. Born in 1957 in a remote village in the province of Punta Arenas, Chile, nothing more. Some speculate this void of information stemmed from a desire to protect her family, as the tight-knit local population, known for their fiery temperaments and distinct traditions, might have sought vengeance, turning her relatives' lives into a nightmare. Roxanna was married, though for reasons still unclear, the identity of her husband remains absent from public records and media coverage. The two had a son together. But it's evident that their marriage didn't reflect the fairy tale many envision. It ended in 2011. Left to raise her child alone, Roxanna faced immense hardship in a village where opportunities were few and far between. Agriculture was the heartbeat of the region, with most residents growing and selling produce. Even local schools emphasized farming as the central focus of education. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. It was in this setting that Roxanna found employment at the Don Gregorio boarding school, which trains students to become agricultural technicians. She worked as a night supervisor at the school, ensuring that students slept at night and did not engage in unruly activities. Her responsibilities didn't include the actual upbringing of the children. Roxanna's son also attended this boarding school, as she worked in the fields during the day and couldn't give him the attention he needed. At the same boarding school where Roxanna worked, Claudio Munoz Ramirez held the position of head of grounds maintenance. His duties often required him to work during the night, which is how he came to meet Roxanna. Despite being 14 years younger than her, they found much to talk about. Roxanna would spend entire nights discussing school affairs and her own failed marriage with Claudio. They had common ground in their personal lives as well. Claudio had 2 daughters whom he adored, but felt disconnected from their mother, contemplating divorce several times. However, he remained in the marriage due to a promise he had made to her late father. Over time, Claudio seemingly forgot his promise and began spending his free time with Roxanna away from his family. Eventually, he made a decisive move. Without explaining himself to his wife, Claudio gathered his belongings and left their home. It was clear he went to Roxanna, who happily welcomed him into her life. Their relationship progressed rapidly and effectively. Roxanna led into her home a man she barely knew, with whom she had only enjoyed nighttime conversations. She seemed to overlook the fact that there were children around needing constant attention. Amidst these enjoyable and heartfelt talks, Roxanna failed to notice Claudio's true nature. He was, in reality, quite temperamental and sometimes even cruel. However, it was perhaps too early to judge who was more cruel between the two. The first serious outburst of aggression from Claudio took place within the walls of the boarding school. On a scheduled community cleanup day, students were assigned different areas to tidy up. Brooms, buckets, dustpans, and rags were distributed, everything needed for a thorough cleaning. As often happens, some students protested and refused to participate. Claudio, responsible for cleanliness but lacking any teaching experience, became infuriated with these students and threatened that, in the absence of teachers at night, he would beat anyone who didn't participate. Whether he would have followed through on this threat is unknown, but the students eventually started cleaning, and later collectively complained to the principal about Claudio's threats of physical violence. The principal, displeased, asked Claudio to submit a voluntary resignation. It's important to note that the Don Gregorio boarding school was practically the only place in the area offering stable and reasonably paid employment. Claudio spent some time looking for work in fields and at fruit bases, but when it became clear his efforts were in vain, he and Roxanna decided to seek a better life elsewhere, leaving her son in the boarding school to continue his education. They deemed it too risky to embark on this venture with him. To avoid dependency on employers, having been burned once already, the couple decided to start their own small business, a fruit kiosk. They moved to a favorable location, the commune of Molina, a couple of hours' drive from the Chilean capital. This place is well known for its vineyards, producing renowned wine brands exported worldwide. Roxanna and Claudio purchased a kiosk near their new home, found suppliers for vegetables and fruits, and made their first steps in their small family business. Claudio handled the purchasing and transportation of the products from suppliers to the kiosk, while Roxanna was in charge of sales throughout the day. Hiring an employee wasn't feasible, as it would mean additional expenses. Moreover, they feared that an employee might not monitor the perishable goods closely enough, leading to further losses. Claudio was visibly upset and even angry when he found out that Roxanna was expecting their first child together. Perhaps it was a moment that required serious reflection. But Roxanna, perhaps blinded by her new relationship and their flourishing business, didn't oppose her husband's view. She agreed that once the child was born, they would soon hand it over to her relatives for upbringing. However, it turned out there was no child to give away. Since that time, Claudio's behavior changed drastically. He often yelled at his wife and sometimes even resorted to physical violence. Neighbors from nearby houses, unhappy with their noisy new neighbors, witnessed this behavior many times and often called the Chilean police, the Carabineros, to intervene and calm the domestic disputes. On one occasion, when the Carabineros arrived in response to a call, they witnessed Roxanna, in tears and almost half naked, running out of the house, followed by Claudio. Roxanna confessed to the officers that she was a victim of systematic domestic violence, which had led to a miscarriage. She even required psychological help after the incident. However, as time passed, the grievances were forgotten, and the troubled couple, as if nothing had happened, continued to live together as before. Following the incident, Claudio should have faced criminal charges, but a compassionate Roxanna decided to give him another chance, extracting a promise that it was a one-time occurrence. Claudio vowed never to repeat such behavior, but his past actions with his ex-wife suggested his words might not hold much weight. Unfortunately, history repeated itself. Claudio temporarily ceased his physical abuse of Roxanna, but developed a habit of leaving home at night to drink heavily in local bars. He spent considerable amounts of their family budget, not only on alcohol, but also on local women of ill repute. Roxanna endured her husband's behavior, believing that Claudio would settle down once they had a child together. In a sense, she was right. In 2013, Roxanna gave birth to a healthy child. Claudio stopped his carousing and fully immersed himself in their business, which now needed to expand. They purchased another kiosk in a neighboring area and another vehicle for product transportation. Roxanna also invested in firearms for protection as they lived and worked in less safe areas. The family's wealth increased significantly, but only on paper. Claudio reverted to his old ways, squandering money on drinking, and again resorting to domestic violence against Roxanna. In Roxanna's testimony, she recounted the escalating abuse in her relationship with Claudio. Initially, Claudio's drinking was infrequent, but it soon increased in frequency. He would return home drunk, hurling baseless accusations of infidelity at Roxanna, accusations that often escalated into both physical and sexual abuse. Even during her pregnancy, Claudio's violence seemed intentional and cruel, culminating in a miscarriage in August 2012 that sent Roxanna into a prolonged and debilitating depression. One night, in keeping with his usual behavior, Claudio went out drinking and failed to come home until the following morning. Despite being accustomed to his disappearances, Roxana still found herself worrying. The real blow came when she discovered that Claudio had stolen 5 million Chilean pesos, around $6,000, that Roxana had saved from the sale of her late mother's house. The money had been hidden in their daughter's room and was meant to help launch a small business the couple had planned together. Instead, Claudio had spent it on alcohol and sex workers. When he finally staggered in late that evening, Roxana confronted him about the missing money. Claudio showed no remorse. He struck her, as he had done so many times before, and casually admitted to blowing through the entire sum. That moment broke something in Roxana. Without saying a word, she walked to the bedroom, opened the drawer where they kept a revolver for protection, returned, and shot Claudio in the chest. He died instantly, surprised by her drastic action. Roxana, equally shocked by her own actions, attempted to stem the bleeding from the fatal gunshot wound, but it was too late. The close-range shot from a .38 caliber bullet was fatal. Roxana's desperate act marked a tragic culmination of ongoing domestic turmoil. Roxana's testimony reveals her profound remorse and recognition of the immorality of her actions. She confesses that when she went for the revolver, her intention was not to intimidate Claudio, but to kill him. She recalls the countless times Claudio abused and assaulted her, and her failure to report him to the authorities, or retract her complaint out of fear. She feared being alone even before they had a child together. After shooting Claudio, Roxana's immediate concern was the potential impact on their daughter, especially if Roxana were imprisoned and the child sent to an institution. That night, Roxana decided that the best way to deal with the situation was to dispose of the body and report Claudio missing, aware that his frequent disappearances during drinking binges were known to the police. Disposing of the body was a daunting task for Roxana, a delicate woman. She decided to remove it piece by piece. First, she used kitchen knives intended for meat cutting to sever the limbs and head. This process required 5 knives, as they kept dulling. Then she boiled the dismembered parts in the largest pots she had, all while playing with her young daughter, who was oblivious to her mother's actions and her father's fate. Roxana's calculated approach to disposing of the body, while maintaining a semblance of normalcy for her daughter, highlights the complexity and desperation of her situation. The day after cooking and cooling the body parts, Roxana packed them into plastic containers, organizing them separately: hands, legs, head, and torso. Each container was then placed in a garbage bag. She loaded them into her car and headed to St. Lucia to scatter the bags on a vacant lot. Before leaving, she thoroughly cleaned her house with bleach. However, once in St. Lucia, she couldn't muster the courage to dispose of the bags from her car, despite finding a suitable spot. In her testimony, Roxana expressed her internal conflict. "It's strange, I had the bravery to commit this heinous crime, and dismember a human body as if it were a piglet. But I couldn't bring myself to dispose of the evidence. I was nervous throughout the drive, feeling constantly watched, fearing that police would stop and search my car at any turn. This fear led to panic, even though I had a backup plan involving my daughter, pretending to rush her to the hospital if stopped. I even thought of how to pinch her to make her cry louder." Unable to discard the remains, Roxana returned home with them, hiding the bags in the garage. She cleaned her car's interior with bleach again, and visited Claudio's relatives, claiming that he had stolen a large sum of money and hadn't been home for days. They merely shrugged in response. She then visited her mother and brother. Her mother was extremely worried about Roxana's behavior. She was not eating, had a glassy-eyed look, and repeatedly asked the same questions. The only question she answered promptly was about Claudio's absence, saying he went to buy goods for their store, but had a flat tire and got delayed. Returning home and alone with her thoughts and the hidden evidence, Roxana broke down. She called her brother for help. When he arrived, she confessed everything and showed him the containers. Naturally, her brother was in shock. When Roxana called her brother, she wanted to vent and share the nightmarish years she endured with Claudio. But above all, she needed his help to get rid of the containers holding the body. However, her brother refused, fearing police involvement and the possibility of being charged as an accomplice. He urged her to confess to the Carabineros, Chilean police, insisting he would do it if she didn't. Disappointed but realizing she had no other choice, Roxanna complied. That night, Roxanna went to the 4th police station and announced her intention to make an important statement. The officers, familiar with her, initially thought she wanted to report her troublesome husband. However, they were shocked by her confession. Roxanna was immediately arrested. The news spread rapidly throughout the area, attracting countless journalists around the station. They waited eagerly to photograph Roxanna as she was led out, hoping to capture a few images and, if lucky, ask her and the officers some questions. As the journalists waited, Roxanna was eventually brought out. Handcuffed and in distress, she exclaimed, "I was afraid he would kill me one day," before being escorted into a police car. The case seemed straightforward. Roxanna had confessed, provided evidence, and voluntarily surrendered. However, prosecutor Monica Ballesteros wanted a deeper investigation. Skeptical of Roxanna's easy confession, she requested an extended arrest to conduct a forensic examination. Ballesteros aimed to prove that Claudio was still alive during the dismemberment, which would significantly increase Roxanna's sentence. The judge granted a 60-day detention for further investigation. Meanwhile, Roxanna's attorney, Carolina Gutierrez, argued that Roxanna acted under extreme emotional distress, possibly exacerbated by postpartum depression and chronic domestic abuse. She emphasized Roxanna's cooperation and voluntary confession as mitigating factors. However, the prosecution's theory that Claudio was alive during dismemberment crumbled after forensic results. It was confirmed that Claudio died from the gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet from the .38 caliber revolver caused a heart rupture and damaged vital organs, disproving the prosecution's initial hypothesis. Given these developments, the aggravating circumstances were dismissed. Another lawyer, Juan Pablo Cardenas, who sought to make a name for himself in this high-profile case, pointed out that the firearm used in the murder was legally registered. He also noted that Roxanna's first report of domestic violence to the police was filed just 20 days after the couple started living together. Psychologist Rodrigo Valenzuela, after a medical examination, submitted documents to the court indicating that Roxanna was extremely mentally unstable at the time of the crime. This meant she wasn't fully aware of her actions, and her emotional instability was linked to the loss of 2 children. One in August 2012 and another just 3 weeks before the crime. Furthermore, a forensic examination requested by the prosecutor revealed that Claudio had a high blood alcohol level of 3 grams per liter at the time of his death. On April 17, 2015, after a year of various examinations, investigations, and evidence gathering, Roxanna's trial began. The media, often sensationalizing tragedies, dubbed the case the Melina Cooks case, alluding to Roxanna's dismemberment and boiling of her former husband. Some unscrupulous journalists seeking to attract attention to their publications even fabricated stories that Roxanna had eaten part of the remains, although this was merely a product of their imagination. Roxanna, aware of the media portrayal and deeply distressed by it, refused to make any statements during the trial. The prosecutors tried to influence the judge by emphasizing that Roxanna committed a grave crime by Chilean standards, patricide. However, they couldn't prove that the murder was premeditated. The defense attorney, in turn, argued that his client acted in self-defense, protecting herself from a brute who had brutally mistreated her for years. The court hearing lasted several weeks, and during this time, the entire population of Chile followed the case closely. Prosecutor Monica requested a 15-year prison sentence for the accused. However, the judges, having carefully listened to the defense and the jury's opinion, sentenced Roxanna to 6 years in a correctional facility with a lenient regime. Claudio's relatives, who understandably wished for a life sentence or even execution for Roxanna and were already protesting when they heard the prosecutor asking for only 15 years, were utterly dismayed by the actual court decision. They tried to deny any violence in the family and argued that Claudio, being a businessman and financially independent, could not have stolen $6,000 from Roxanna. They also claimed that Claudio had confessed to them that Roxanna often took out the revolver from the closet and told her husband that she would kill him one day. Claudio's sister, in an interview with the press, even tried to blame Chile as a state, arguing that it's a country where there is no justice, and the judicial system is utterly corrupt, given that such brutal criminals are given such short sentences, comparable to minor robberies. Even Giselle, Claudio's first wife, defended her ex-husband, assuring everyone that there couldn't have been any violence from Claudio's side. She had shared a home with him for many years, and throughout that time, he reportedly never once became physically violent. In contrast, Roxanna was said to have frequently instigated arguments, driven by jealousy and possessiveness. After her conviction, Roxanna served only about 2/3 of her sentence in the correctional facility before being moved to a semi-open educational center in Talca due to good behavior. She was permitted to stay in contact with her daughter and was ultimately granted early release. The media reignited national attention on the case, and many citizens expressed outrage over the early freedom granted to the cook from Molina. Nonetheless, some people, while acknowledging Roxanna as a killer, defended her actions by viewing her primarily as a victim of long-term abuse. The case remains a topic of ongoing debate across Chile. Ultimately, this story serves as a stark reminder of the severe consequences that can arise when domestic violence goes unaddressed. Moving on to the next case. Thomas Bartlett. Thomas Bartlett, a teenager from Sugar Land, Texas, grew up surrounded by wealth and affection from his well-off parents. He attended Clements High School but was expelled after a series of burglaries. During the expulsion process, a mental health professional evaluated him and diagnosed Thomas with clinical symptoms of delusional paranoid disorder. Despite this diagnosis, his parents continued to indulge him with a life of luxury. Devoted to their son, the Whitakers bought Thomas a lakeside home in Texas where he could live rent-free while attending a nearby college. They also gifted him several luxury cars and covered his hefty university tuition. Captivated by Thomas's charm and his stories of success, they believed his claims that he was excelling in college and would graduate on time. On what was supposed to be his graduation day, they even gave him a $40,000 Rolex watch as a present. But the truth was, Thomas never actually graduated. Thomas was never actually enrolled in college, and just hours after receiving the extravagant Rolex, he would go on to commit a horrific act against the very people who had given him everything. On December 10, 2003, Thomas falsely told his parents that he had just completed his final exams and was eagerly anticipating his graduation. To celebrate, they all went to Papadu restaurant, sharing what none of them knew would be their final meal together. The Whitakers had no idea that their son had been living a web of lies. He was not on track to graduate, nor even enrolled at all. His deception was so deeply entrenched that Thomas couldn't face the possibility of his parents discovering the truth. To keep his secret safe, he enlisted the help of Christopher Brashear and Stephen Champagne. While the Whitakers enjoyed their meal, Brashear broke into their home following Thomas's orders, taking the husband's gun and ammunition from a locked safety box in the bedroom. He also ransacked the house to make it look like a burglary had occurred and waited inside for the family's return. Meanwhile, Champagne waited nearby in a car, ready to act as the getaway driver. When the family arrived, Thomas said that he had to grab his cell phone from his parked car and separated momentarily from the rest of the family. The family entered the house with the younger brother Kevin, 19, leading the way. When Kevin initially saw the masked intruder, he laughed thinking it was a prank being pulled off by one of Thomas's friends in honor of his graduation. But when he was shot once in the chest and collapsed to the floor, his mother, Patricia, screamed out, "Oh God, no," and all pretenses of a light-hearted prank flew out the window. Kent, Patricia's husband of 26 years, ran inside and was subsequently shot in the shoulder. Thomas, returning from his car, then ran into the house and pretended to struggle with the gunman, getting shot himself in his left arm as a way to stage his innocence. The gunman then ran out of the back door and hopped over the fence and jumped into the getaway car. Kevin, the little brother, died almost instantly, and his mother Patricia died while being airlifted to the nearby hospital. The father, Kent, was also airlifted to the hospital and survived the murder attempt. Thomas, in an attempt to divert suspicion, initially told officers that their attacker was African American. Kent, Thomas's father, initially vowed to forgive whomever murdered his family, but his faith was shaken when it was revealed that his precious son, who had been living and recovering with Kent before fleeing to Mexico upon hearing that he was going to soon be arrested, was actually the murderer. Thomas hid in Mexico under the assumed name of Rudy Rios for almost a year until in February, Mexican authorities delivered him back to the U.S. to face trial. During the trial, Christopher Brashear claimed Thomas promised a cut of the $1 million insurance policy taken out on his parents, but it was revealed no such policy existed. In all actuality, Thomas committed murders out of shame and cowardice, not for money. He was terrified of the truth coming out. Nevertheless, Kent Whitaker stuck by his son's side and believed him when he blamed his mental illness for the evil deeds. Thomas, ever the master manipulator, even went so far as to claim that his death penalty conviction would further victimize his father, as he would lose his only remaining son. Shockingly, his father Kent stayed by his side and testified repeatedly that he had forgiven his son. Originally, Thomas's execution date was set for early 2018, but upon his father's ferocious fighting, his sentence was changed from death to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 2. Who is Jean-Claude Romand? Born in Lons-des-Saunières, Jean-Claude Romand was not the studious type. After graduating high school, he signed up for college classes at the Lycée du Parle, but unable to handle the grueling academics, he dropped out after only one semester. He re-enrolled as a medical student but still could not handle the workload. His lies began when he told his family that he had passed a second-year final exam that would enable him to begin the process of being a doctor. The problem was, he never took the exam. That lie would catapult into a full-blown second life in which he was a successful doctor for the World Health Organization, researching the hardening and thickening of arteries and having very prestigious academic and political connections. He kept this highly specific lie up for 18 years. In all actuality, Romand would spend his days at the World Health Organization. However, he would simply wander the building and use their free informational services to learn more about medicine. Occasionally, he would invent a work conference that would supposedly take him to far-flung places in the world, but actually he would only travel to the airport and sleep in a motel close by. In the airport motel, he would research new medical technologies and various tourism information about whatever country he was supposedly visiting. That way, he would come home full of new information, both medical and travel-centered, to keep up the lies to his family. In order to maintain appearances and make ends meet, he would take money from relatives and close acquaintances, promising that he was investing the money into hedge funds and international endeavors. His wife also worked full-time, and during this tenure of lies, Romand took up with a wealthy mistress who loaned him about 900,000 Swiss francs, about $930,000. His lies, however, had become unbearable and tenuous, and instead of admitting that he was a jobless fraud, he decided to cover his lies with actions far more sinister. On the January 9, 1993, he took out 2,000 Swiss francs from his joint account with his wife and borrowed a gun from his father. He purchased a suppressor for that gun, a .22 long rifle carbine, and at the ammunition shop also purchased tear gas canisters. That evening, he used a rolling pin to brutally murder his wife, leaving her body in the bed all night. The next morning, he woke his children and set them up with breakfast and cartoons as normal. Covering up their mother's absence with another lie, he waited until they were asleep that night and used the gun to kill each as they dreamt. His next victims were his own parents. After sharing a meal with them, he used the gun to fatally shoot both his mother and father, as well as their family dog. His final intended victim was his wealthy ex-lover, with whom he had been involved in an affair over the previous years. He picked her up under the pretense of attending a high-class dinner with one of his political contacts. Instead, he drove her to a secluded road and, pretending to be lost, asked her to get out to look for street signs. Once she stepped out, he attempted to strangle her and sprayed tear gas into her face. However, she fought back fiercely, forcing him to relent. After apologizing and making her swear to keep the incident secret, he drove her home. Romand then returned to his own house, where the bodies of his wife and children still lay inside. After watching television, he poured gasoline around the house and set it on fire. He took some expired sleeping pills, which police initially thought were an attempt to end his own life, but later suspected were meant as a cover-up to explain why he did not rescue his family from the blaze. Despite this, he had access to far stronger, more effective drugs that were not expired. At first, authorities believed his uncooperative behavior stemmed from trauma over the fire, but a darker truth soon emerged. The police found that his wife had been beaten to death, and the children were shot, revealing a far more chilling motive behind the tragedy. They did not die in a fire. In 1996, Romand was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. While in prison, he was clinically diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, which came as no surprise to anyone who would ever come in contact with him. 3. The Tiger Child. Jennifer Pan is the daughter of Vietnamese-born immigrants, Bic and Han, who settled down in Toronto, Canada. Because of her parents' Vietnamese upbringing, they had a very specific parenting style known today as tiger parenting, where strict rules are enforced and very little praise is given to children regardless of their accomplishments. Bic and Han were hardworking and thrifty citizens who used their earnings from an auto parts factory that they both worked at and were able to buy themselves a large house and nice cars. They built a life that they wanted their children to emulate, and therefore set very high goals for Jennifer and her younger brother, Felix. Made to learn piano at the age of 4, Jennifer was constantly being pushed by her father to learn new skills. She was an acclaimed figure skater and flute player, and her friends recall her father's stern and watchful gaze as he monitored their each and every practice. At her father's insistence, she never dated nor did she attend any social gatherings, and by the age of 22 recalls a friend, she had never gone to a club, been drunk, visited a friend's cottage, or gone on vacation without her family. Despite her father's insistence that practice makes perfect, Jennifer did not receive outstanding marks in high school academics and routinely forged her straight-A report cards to cover up her actual grades of CS and DS. By senior year, Jennifer's lies were insurmountable, and after failing a calculus class, she had her early admission rescinded from Ryerson University. Jennifer, too ashamed to admit to her parents what had actually happened, pretended that she was given many scholarships in order to go to the university for free. While her parents thought she was sitting in college classes, she was actually working at local cafes and as a private piano instructor. Jennifer kept up the lie so specifically that she even purchased used textbooks and watched videos related to her area of study. She then continued to deceive when she told her parents that she was accepted and given free tuition at a pharmacology program in the University of Toronto. She then got permission from them to live near the college during the week. In all actuality, though, she was staying with a boy, Daniel Wong, her secret high school lover. Her lies became too bold and too specific, however, when she told her parents that she was working as a volunteer at the well-known and world-renowned Toronto Hospital for Sick Children. Her parents started questioning her story and became suspicious when they noticed she did not have any sort of uniform or even a hospital ID badge. Wanting to know the truth, Jennifer's mother secretly followed her daughter into work and soon learned it was all a farce. Upon this realization, Jennifer's father wanted to kick her out of the house, but persuaded by Jennifer's mother, the girl who lied was allowed to stay. Throughout much turmoil and fighting, Jennifer's parents eventually learned that she had not even completed high school. But while they certainly weren't understanding, they did help and encourage her to take the necessary classes to get her high school diploma so that she could apply to actual universities. However, their forgiveness did not mean their kindness, and Jennifer was very much a prisoner in her own home, not allowed to contact her boyfriend under any circumstances. Resorting to secret telephone calls to Daniel, Jennifer soon became worried as Daniel was not as interested in her anymore due to her extreme social restrictions. Jennifer soon found out that he was dating another woman and that he was falling for that girl fast. To combat Daniel's straying eye, Jennifer concocted a story of a brutal break-in and subsequent attack. She also fabricated a story about a bullet being mailed to her from Wong's current girlfriend. Her fantastic stories seemed to be effective, and they all came to a head when Jennifer convinced Daniel to help her hire a professional hitman for $10,000 to kill her parents. She told Daniel that the death of her parents would lead her to inherit over $500,000 and that they could then move in together and live happily ever after. On November 8, 2010, Jennifer, after successfully putting the hit out on her parents, left the door to the family home unlocked before going to bed. Under the cover of darkness, 3 hitmen entered the large home and demanded all of the money in the house from Jennifer's parents. They then took Jennifer's parents to the basement where they were each shot several times. Jennifer's brother was luckily not living with his parents by then. Jennifer's mother was killed, but Jennifer's father would shockingly survive the attack. The 3 men fled, having taken many of the home's valuables as well as $2,000 cash from Jennifer herself. During the attack, Jennifer claims she was tied up but that she was able to overcome her bondage and call 911. The investigation quickly focused on Jennifer as a suspect, as she was the only one unscathed. Detectives commented that it was an atypical scenario in a home invasion to attempt to kill 2 of the occupants, but leave 1 eyewitness unharmed. Computer analysis of Jennifer's testimony to the police also revealed inconsistencies with her statement, and once her father was able to be interviewed by police, his story varied drastically from Jennifer's. Jennifer, Daniel, and the 3 hitmen were arrested and all given life sentences with the possibility of parole after 25 years served. 4. The Fake Beard Bandit. Known as the Fake Beard Bandit, Brett Ryan was no stranger to a life of crime. He had committed a string of bank robberies while dressed as an elderly man in order to pay off his nearly $36,000 debt. Telling the judge at sentencing that he had suffered an extreme manic episode as a result of a depressive spell and his recent breakup with a girlfriend, the judge gave him a light sentence of only 3 years and 9 months. In prison, he had good behavior and was released on day parole, which allowed him to only come back to prison to sleep. When he got out for good, he got engaged to Kristen Baxter, a woman he met presumably while out on day parole. He was upfront about his criminal past as a bank robber, but he told her he had changed. He claimed to be a college graduate with a well-paying job, but it was all a lie. His mother discovered that he was deceiving Kristen Baxter and threatened not only to reveal the truth to Kristen, but also to cut off her financial support for Brett. With the wedding only weeks away, Brett chose to take drastic measures to keep his secrets hidden. Just 3 weeks before the ceremony, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Using an arrow from a crossbow stored in his mother's garage, Brett stabbed her in the chest and then strangled her right there in the garage. Hearing the commotion, his younger brother Christopher rushed in, only to be shot in the neck with an arrow aimed from the crossbow. Brett then concealed both bodies under a tarp. The eldest brother, Lee, alerted by the noise, came to check on the situation but was attacked by Brett as well. Fortunately, Lee managed to escape and found safety at a neighbor's house, where he called the police. Meanwhile, Brett's older brother, Alexander, arrived at the scene for unrelated reasons and was suddenly stabbed in the driveway by another arrow from the crossbow. He was found lying in the driveway when police arrived. Brett tried to cover his tracks by creating an electronic footprint at his house miles away. He attached a wooden cooking spoon onto a string tied to the ceiling fan, which would spin so that the spoon tapped the enter button on the keyboard of his laptop, prompting the playing of various YouTube videos. He also pre-programmed his email to send various messages from his home computer to make it appear as if he were home and not killing his entire family at their house. The technological alibi did not work and Brett was arrested outside of his mother's home. He was charged with first-degree murder for killing his brother Christopher and 2 counts of second-degree murder for killing his mother and their younger brother Alexander. He was also convicted of attempted murder of his older brother, Lee. Brett received 3 concurrent life sentences with a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years until he can apply for parole. Needless to say, the marriage never happened. 5. Impress or perish. In a low-level position at a children's psychiatric unit of a Salt Lake City hospital, Mark Hacking always secretly idolized the doctors that he worked under. He wanted to be just like them, and through a carefully constructed set of lies, he was able to get everyone around him to believe he was on the path to medical school. His family, including his wife Lori, believed he had graduated with a bachelor's degree from the University of Utah, but in all actuality, he had dropped out. There had been hints of Mark's lies for years, though the hackings never connected the dots. 3 years prior to her death, Lori received a voicemail from Mark's mother, confused, stating how she had just attempted to pay Mark's undergraduate tuition, but when she called the college, they said he was not registered as a student. Mark brushed it off, saying he had just forgotten to cross a few T's and dot a few I's in the registration process, and that it was all fixed now. His family believed he had worked it all out, and was a full-time student who eventually graduated with honors. His mother had even helped him with term papers and allowed him to keep his old textbooks at her house. 1 year later, he began an elaborate process to make it look like he was applying to medical school after he seemingly received his undergraduate degree. He would speak of the application process and interviews extensively, even going so far as having his family members drive him to prestigious Ivy League schools for so-called interviews. He flew to Manhattan, where he stayed with his cousin under the pretense of having an interview at the University Columbia Medical School, afterwards talking at length about how he felt the interview went. Eventually, Mark told everyone he had been accepted to the University of North Carolina Medical School, and he and his wife Lori procured housing in North Carolina and prepared to embark on the cross-country move. Lori had quit her job at Wells Fargo and had packed all their possessions in preparation for the upcoming relocation. During this time, Lori also found out she was pregnant. On the July 15, 2004, Lori emailed her and Mark's family their new address in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Whether the house was actually there or was another part of Mark's lie is unknown, as they would never move in. On the July 16th, Lori received a phone call from the University of North Carolina which caused her to leave work early, crying and obviously distraught. The details of the phone call are unknown. But in the early hours of the July 19th, Mark called the police to report his wife as missing. He said she had left for an early morning jog and never returned. The case garnered almost instant media attention, and Mark could be seen on live television making a plea for any information on his wife's whereabouts and thanking the search and rescue workers for doing their jobs. But in the days succeeding, police quickly became suspicious when his financial history revealed he had bought a new bedroom mattress in the minutes prior to making the 911 call. On the July 20th, Mark was reported by a nearby hotel for walking in public naked with only his shoes on. He was checked into a hospital by his family, although many people thought him to be faking, as experts pointed out that had he truly gone crazy, he would not have kept his shoes on. As the investigation continued to turn up startling facts, his family was notified that his life had been a lie. This confrontation with his father led Mark to confess to the brutal murder of Lori, admitting that he killed her while she was asleep and disposed of her body in a dumpster. On October 1st, police discovered her badly decomposed remains buried beneath nearly 2,000 pounds of garbage at a landfill. Lori's parents keep cherished memories of their daughter throughout their home, preserving the years of her life before her tragic death. After the revelation of Mark's crime, a digital photography company called Orem generously offered to remove Mark from all family photos at no cost, and Lori's headstone bears no mention of his name. Mark was sentenced to 6 years to life, a verdict many found shockingly lenient. This case sparked the creation of Lori's Law, which established a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years for murder. Mark will be eligible for parole in February 1935, a sentence many believe is far too light. Lori's brother said the most painful part is that none of this was necessary. He believes Lori would have loved Mark regardless, as long as he was genuinely trying, and that Mark's elaborate deception was for himself, not for her. To honor Lori's memory, the University of Utah offers the Lori Hacking Scholarship, granting free tuition each year to a woman who has overcome adversity and challenging circumstances to reach her goals. Moving on to the next case. Ventura County. In the late 1970s, Ventura County, California, was shaken by a series of unsolved crimes that left a grim mark on its history. 3 women, Kimberly Fritz, Velvet Sanchez, and Lorraine Rodriguez, were found strangled. At the same time, California was experiencing a surge in violent crime, with authorities aware of other unresolved cases nearby. Investigators examined the circumstances of these women's deaths and couldn't dismiss the chilling possibility that a predator, still at large, was targeting vulnerable victims across the region. Over time, the cases went cold, but the evidence was carefully preserved, awaiting advances in forensic technology to bring new hope. Decades passed before a breakthrough finally connected these women in the most horrifying way. In the 1970s, California was a land of contrasts. With its sunny beaches and iconic landscapes, it was a paradise attracting families chasing the American dream. Yet beneath this idyllic surface, a darker reality was emerging. Crime rates were climbing, and a growing sense of unease spread through the state, especially in major cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco. What was once considered a safe refuge for residents became the center of a series of brutal, high-profile crimes that rattled the entire nation. As this wave of violence swept through, no community seemed immune. Fear and uncertainty ran rampant, with headlines reporting one horrific crime after another. It was during this turbulent period that the first of a string of chilling cases emerged, beginning with Kimberly Fritz's tragic story. At just 18 years old, Kimberly's life was cruelly ended. On May 29, 1977, her lifeless body was found in a motel room in Port Hueneme, California. The circumstances of her death were horrifying. She had been strangled with her own undergarments, a grim testament to the savagery of her attacker. Kimberly, who had recently relocated from Ann Arbor, Michigan, was one of 3 sisters. What initially appeared to be an isolated incident would soon reveal itself as the beginning of a far darker pattern, connecting her fate to the growing wave of terror sweeping California. Just months later, on September 9, 31-year-old Velvet Sanchez was found slain in a similar manner. Her body was discovered in a motel in Oxnard, California. Her life taken in the same brutal fashion, strangulation with her undergarments. Velvet had recently left her job in the U.S. Navy Exchange, and she was a mother. The horror continued later that year when, in late December, the body of 21-year-old Lorraine Rodriguez was found dumped along Laguna Road in the Oxnard Plain area. Lorraine, too, had been strangled. A mother of 2 young children, Lorraine was remembered by her family as a loving and devoted mother, whose world revolved around her son and daughter. The discovery of her body marked the third in a series of violent crimes that would leave authorities baffled for decades to come. When the bodies of Kimberly Fritz, Velvet Sanchez, and Lorraine Rodriguez were discovered, investigators were immediately struck by the similarities between the cases. Each woman had been strangled with her own undergarments, and their bodies were arranged in identical degrading positions. These shared characteristics led Dr. Ronald Kornblum, the coroner medical examiner at the time, to publicly suggest in 1978 that a single individual was likely responsible for all 3 slayings. This theory was compelling, especially in an era when the concept of a serial offender was just beginning to enter the public's consciousness. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the precursor to the modern understanding of criminal profiling, was still in its infancy. And the study of serial offenders was largely uncharted territory. Investigators relied heavily on patterns and gut instincts, rather than the psychological profiling techniques that would develop in the years to come. As the investigation progressed, detectives came across troubling inconsistencies that cast doubts on the theory of a single perpetrator. While the methods of strangulation and body positioning were consistent, subtle differences in the evidence surrounding Lorraine Rodriguez's slaying began to surface. These discrepancies were minor, but raised questions about whether all 3 slayings were truly connected or if the similarities were simply coincidental. These doubts were only emphasized by the limitations of the time. The lack of a clear suspect or strong leads made it difficult for investigators to sustain public interest in the cases. What also added to the difficulties for detectives was the scarcity of witnesses and credible leads. The victims, all of whom were prostitutes, led transient lifestyles that made it difficult for investigators to piece together their final movements. Kimberly, Velvet, and Lorraine came from different backgrounds, but were drawn into a world where prostitute work was less a choice and more a means of survival. They were driven by economic hardship, lack of support, or challenging personal circumstances. The details of their lives are scarce, leaving only fragments of who they were beyond their professions. Despite their deep connections to their families, these aspects of their lives were overshadowed by their involvement in prostitute work, which shaped the limited narrative shared with the public. The stigma attached to their profession further complicated matters, as potential witnesses were often reluctant to come forward, fearing judgment or legal repercussions. Even with the clear connections between the slayings, the cases of Kimberly Fritz, Velvet Sanchez, and Lorraine Rodriguez received little attention from the media. The lack of media not only hindered the investigation, but also reinforced the stigma surrounding their lives. 14 years later, on July 6, 1992, 29-year-old Nona Stamey Cobb was last seen at the Welcome Center on Interstate 85 in Cleveland County, North Carolina. Eyewitnesses saw her get into a truck driven by an unknown man. The next day, her body was found on the northbound side of Interstate 77 in Surry County, over 100 miles away. Nona had been strangled, a detail that immediately reminded investigators of the California murders. Like the Ventura County victims, Nona was a sex worker, and her body was left near a highway. This pattern suggested the work of a methodical and calculating offender. Because of these similarities, investigators initially suspected Sean Patrick Goebel, who had been arrested in 1995 for comparable crimes. However, DNA testing from Nona's crime scene told a different story. Goebel was excluded as a suspect, and her case remained unsolved for nearly 30 years. The turning point came with advances in DNA technology, giving investigators a powerful new tool to revisit cold cases. In the case of Nona Stamey Cobb, whose case had remained unsolved since 1992, investigators decided to take another look at the DNA evidence collected from the scene. Using advanced techniques, they were able to generate a complete DNA profile from the biological evidence found on her body. This profile was then entered into Cody's. To the investigators' surprise, the DNA from Nona's case matched a profile in Cody's, one belonging to Warren Luther Alexander. Warren Luther Alexander was born on January 12, 1951. And his early life appeared quite ordinary. Growing up in Oxnard, California, he attended local schools throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Like many young men of his generation, he enlisted in the military, serving in the U.S. Marine Corps during the tumultuous Vietnam War era. A period that left many veterans grappling with post-traumatic stress and challenges in readjusting to civilian life. After completing his military service, Alexander briefly worked as a taxi driver. This role likely introduced him to a transient lifestyle and frequent interactions with strangers, experiences that would later shape his career as a long-haul trucker. By the 1970s, he had returned to Oxnard and embarked on a trucking career. A profession that would dominate the next 3 decades of his life and provide the means and opportunity for a series of horrific crimes. His childhood in Oxnard, combined with his return during the 1970s, coincided with the timeline of the California slayings. This potentially gave him a local advantage in selecting victims and evading detection. By the time he was living in Diamond Head, Mississippi, advancements in DNA technology led to the connection. This DNA match resulted in Alexander's arrest in March 2022 for the case of Nona Cobb. But the implications of this discovery extended far beyond North Carolina. A year after Alexander's arrest, Ventura County's Cold Case Unit began re-examining the 1977 slayings of Kimberly Fritz, Velvet Sanchez, and Lorraine Rodriguez. This renewed focus involved uploading evidence from the crime scenes into a national DNA database used by slayings detectives across the country. The hope was that advancements in forensic technology might yield new insights or connections. As they meticulously reanalyzed the preserved evidence, investigators hoped to uncover links that had eluded them for decades. This effort led to a match with Warren Luther Alexander's profile, connecting his DNA from Nona Cobb's case to the crime scenes in California. Alexander's DNA became the crucial link that finally solved the cold cases from 1977, bringing renewed hope for justice for the victims and their families. Despite the seriousness of the charges, the Ventura County District Attorney's Office has opted not to pursue the end-of-life penalty for Alexander. District Attorney Eric Nazarenko explained that pursuing capital punishment would extend the timeline of the case significantly. and with aging witnesses, there is an urgent need to proceed. Instead, the prosecution is seeking a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Alexander's legal proceedings were put into motion with his arraignment commencing in Ventura County Superior Court on August 21, 2024, where he pleaded not guilty. He is currently being held in Ventura County Jail without bail. As the investigation progresses, authorities remain committed to uncovering the full extent of Alexander's alleged crimes. The collaborative efforts of the District Attorney's Office, the Ventura County Sheriff's Office, local police departments, and the FBI shines a spotlight on the dedication to achieving justice. The arrest of Alexander also unearthed a disturbing trend that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, has been monitoring since the early 2000s. As investigators continue to dig deeper into Alexander's past, they are uncovering a history that aligns with the profiles of other identified serial offender truckers. In February 2004, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation alerted the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, after discovering a concerning number of women whose lives were taken and then found along highways. This prompted VICAP analysts to examine similar cases across the nation. Their findings revealed hundreds of violent crimes spanning decades, many sharing common characteristics. The victims were predominantly women engaged in high-risk activities, such as prostitute work, hitchhiking, or substance abuse. The bodies were often discovered along or near highways, particularly at truck stops or rest areas. The nature of these cases frequently crossed jurisdictional lines, complicating investigations and connections between them. In response to these troubling revelations, the FBI launched the Highway Serial Killings (HSK) initiative in February 2009. Understanding the need for a unified effort, this program was designed to gather and analyze data on highway-related murders, identify serial offenders operating across state borders, coordinate between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, and provide resources to help solve these complex cases. Since its start, the initiative has identified over 850 victims and about 450 possible suspects. The capture and conviction of Warren Luther Alexander have brought some closure to the families of Kimberly Fritz, Lorraine Sanchez, and Velvet Rodriguez, who have waited nearly 50 years for answers. However, the investigation remains ongoing, and sadly, more victims are expected to be found. As investigators persist in their efforts, they are not only seeking justice for the women whose lives were tragically taken in 1977 but are also working to discover any additional victims linked to Alexander's crimes. Given the parallels between the California murders and Nona Stamy Cobb's case, detectives anticipate uncovering more offenses committed by Alexander, ensuring that all victims receive the recognition and justice they deserve. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.